Welcome to this explainer. If you look around today, global politics feels, well, incredibly insecure, right? Fractured even. But how on earth do we get here from the absolute unbridled euphoria of 1989? Today, we're going to unpack this massive 30-year shift to really help you understand the invisible forces shaping the world you live in right now. By zooming in on this highly specific window of history, we can actually start to make some sense of our current global landscape. Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We're going to start with the optimism of 1989, move right into the populist resurgence we're seeing today, look at history as a natural experiment, explore some fascinating paths not taken, and then finally, map out the frameworks of the global order. Let's get right into it. Part 1. The optimism of 1989, the fall of the wall, and the rise of democracy. Let's travel back for a second to late 1989. The Soviet grip was finally loosening, and the shock and enthusiasm were just palpable. You had Dan Rather famously broadcasting the symbolic tearing down of the Berlin Wall, as border guards literally dismantled it piece by piece. And man, this optimism spread like wildfire. Democratization was marching across Eastern Europe. Places like South Africa were transitioning to a multiracial democracy. And even seemingly impossible conflicts, like the one in Northern Ireland, actually began moving toward a settlement. It truly felt like a massive, once-in-a-lifetime global turning point. So because of all this, in the early 90s, experts genuinely believed we had crossed the finish line. This birthed the famous idea of the end of history. Basically, this was the absolute confidence that liberal democracy and democratic capitalism were snowballing across the globe as the final victorious form of human government. The dominant mindset back then? It was that the world was settling into a permanent, peaceful equilibrium that was going to lift millions out of poverty. Which brings us to part 2, the populist resurgence, from euphoria to insecurity. Fast forward to 2017, and that post-Cold War stability completely shatters. Germany has this strict 5% threshold to gain parliamentary seats. So when the far-right, anti-system party Alternative for Deutschland crossed it, it was an absolute earthquake. Traditional parties just hemorrhaged support and had to form this reluctant super coalition merely to keep the fringes at bay. Decades of establishment stability were pretty much broken overnight. And the thing is, this wasn't just an isolated German phenomenon. If we look at the data across Europe and the US in 2016 and 2017, the trend is undeniable. The unanticipated Brexit shock, the US presidential election, far-right parties surging in Belgium and Italy. Across the board, anti-establishment forces delivered massive blows to the traditional system. The establishment was shrinking, and fringe movements were suddenly dictating the narrative. Now, seeing establishment parties weaken, while fringe extremes gain footholds, naturally draws some heavy historical comparisons. It leaves many anxious observers pointing back to this staggering statistic: 37%. That was the percentage of the vote won by the Nazi Party in Germany's July 1932 election. It forces us to ask, are we watching a replay of the highly unstable political systems of the 1920s and 30s? For a lot of people, today's political fragmentation feels like a terrifying case of going back to the future. Moving on to part 3, history as a natural experiment, testing political science. To really understand how we got from 1989 to today, we need a rigorous method, not just a dry history lesson. The fall of communism didn't just change maps on a wall. It actually gave researchers a massive, real-time natural experiment. Prior to 1989, political scientists were essentially stuck cycling old theories through the exact same stale Cold War datasets. But suddenly, 1989 injected a gold standard of fresh data, creating a whole new smorgasbord of parliamentary democracies that allowed us to finally test long-established conventional wisdom. For example, we can now use this fresh data to test a huge assumption. Does a growing market economy actually guarantee democratic freedom? The old theory assumed that as economies modernize, democratic changes just inevitably follow. But the post-1989 data completely challenges this, especially when you look at the state-run capitalism of places like China and Vietnam. They modernize their economies while retaining non-democratic politics. This forces us to completely rethink the old rules about how we trade with and view emerging global superpowers today. Part 4. Exploring paths not taken, the mechanics of policy. Rather than just diagnosing the problems, we have to look back and ask the tough what-if questions about choices our leaders ignored. What if NATO had been shut down at the end of the Cold War instead of expanding? Was there a different path after 9/11 besides a massive global war on terror? What if the 2008 financial crisis had been handled completely differently? Mapping these missed off-ramps is absolutely crucial for objectively evaluating if there were more effective, politically viable alternative paths that could have prevented our current reality. This brings us to a somewhat harsh reality. Political theory often ignores the real world, suggesting unworkable, utopian ideas doesn't actually solve problems. Take economist Thomas Piketty's proposed 4% global wealth tax, for instance. It sounds great in theory, but we have to look at what can actually be achieved. We have to balance what should happen with how to actually implement it. If a policy can't survive the brutal mechanics of the real world, it absolutely doesn't help us solve these massive global shifts. Finally, Part 5, Mapping the Global Order, Frameworks of the Modern Era. Let's explore the specific frameworks that defined this 30-year era. With communism off the table as an economic alternative, one framework absolutely dominated the globe. The Washington Consensus was essentially neoliberalism taken global, unquestioned, and often pushed by institutions like the IMF as a strict condition for loans. It fundamentally restructured the entire relationship between business, labor, and government, all operating under the massive confidence that unregulated, or at least mildly regulated, free market capitalism would deliver the absolute best results for everyone. But as we map this out, the trajectory stepped really quickly away from that 90s optimism into a very messy reality. We moved from a unipolar world of US dominance straight into 9/11 and the War on Terror, which pretty much shattered that end of history illusion. And then finally, the post-2008 world ushered in our current politics of insecurity, marked by resurgent global powers, the rise of state capitalism, and deeply fractured societies. These specific data points reveal exactly why voters felt so incredibly abandoned. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, governments essentially bailed out elites while leaving the workforce completely exposed to deep economic shocks. Political leaders entirely misdiagnosed the economic anxiety that was brewing on the ground, and in many cases, they pushed through political reforms that only compounded the damage, ultimately creating the massive societal fractures we are living with right now. So we've seen how quickly the world shifted from the joy of 1989 to the deep insecurity of today. The challenge now isn't just diagnosing the problem, right? It's finding politically feasible paths forward. So the ultimate purpose of this explainer is to leave you with this final, provocative thought. How do we actually implement the real-world political mechanics required to fix these deep global fractures? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.